The air in the barracks of Auschwitz, I was thick with the stench of disease, unwashed bodies, and an overriding, metallic taste of fear. But among the prisoners who navigated this man-made hell on earth, one phrase, whispered like a death sentence, could freeze the blood in an instant. Block 11. To the casual observer, Block 11 looked no different from the other brick buildings lining the stark avenues of the main camp. It was a solid two-story structure, orderly and sterile on the outside. But within the camp's grim hierarchy, it was known by another name, the Death Block. It was a prison within a prison, a fortress designed not just to confine, but to systematically break the human spirit through a meticulously engineered regime of torture. To understand Block 11, one had to understand the cruel ecosystem of Auschwitz. Originally a set of Polish army barracks, the camp had mutated under Nazi Germany into a sprawling empire of mass murder. Every day, crowded cattle cars rattled onto the train tracks, carrying thousands of men, women, and children. For the vast majority, their journey ended within hours at the gas chambers of Birkenau. But for those deemed fit to work, survival was merely a slow, agonizing postponement of death. They were subjected to brutal labor, starvation rations, and the unpredictable sadism of guards like Commandant Rudolf Haas, the notorious Irma Gries, and Joseph Kramer, in a place where a prisoner could be flogged to death for merely reaching for a second helping of watery soup or putting their freezing hands into their pockets. Maintaining total psychological dominance was the SS' highest priority. Block 11 was the ultimate tool of that dominance. It operated as the camp's internal Gestapo headquarters, a black hole from which few ever returned. The ground floor of Block 11 was a place of frantic, terrifying noise. It was here that prisoners suspected of sabotage, smuggling, or participating in the camp's underground resistance were brought for interrogation. The SS demanded names, dates, and confessions, and they had a myriad of tools to extract them. The most infamous device in Block 11 was the brainchild of SS Oberscharfer Wilhelm Boger, a man whose name became synonymous with pure sadism. It was known as the Boger swing. The device was deceptively simple, a 1-meter-long iron bar, suspended by heavy chains from the ceiling. A prisoner would be marched into the room, stripped naked, and forced to bend over the bar. Their wrists were securely manacled to their ankles, locking them into a helpless, fetal position. Once secured, a guard would shove the prisoner, sending them swinging across the chamber in a long, agonizingly slow arc. Boger would stand in the center of the room, calmly asking questions. At first, his voice would be quiet, almost conversational. Then, as the prisoner remained silent or protested their innocence, his voice would bark out, finally erupting into a terrifying bellow. With every return swing, a second guard armed with a crowbar or a heavy whip would strike the victim across the buttocks and back. The rhythm was relentless. Swing, strike, question. Swing, strike, question. Prisoners would scream, faint from the unimaginable agony, and be revived with buckets of icy water, only to be thrown back into the horrific dance. The blows continued until the skin split and the muscles tore, reducing the human form to a bleeding, unrecognizable pulp. Most perished during the ordeal. For those who survived the swing, they were reduced to a sack of bones and flayed flesh, dragged across the concrete floor to a dark cell to await their final execution. If the ground floor of Block 11 was a theater of active violence, the basement was a monument to psychological and physical claustrophobia. It was a subterranean labyrinth divided into specialized punishment cells. Among the most feared were the Staybunker, the standing cells. Architecturally, they were a triumph of perverted ingenuity. A single standing cell measured roughly 1 square yard. Through a tiny opening at ground level, for prisoners would be forced to crawl inside. Once the heavy wooden door was bolted shut, The space was so tightly packed that it was physically impossible for any of them to sit down, turn around, or even bend their knees. They were forced to stand flush against one another, chest to back, breathing each other's stale, warm breath. Survivors recalled prisoners being forced into these cells for up to 10 days at a time. In a cruel twist of efficiency, some were even forced to perform backbreaking manual labor during the day, only to be marched back to Block 11 at night to be jammed back into the standing cells, deprived of sleep and rest. Air was a luxury in the stay bunker. The only ventilation came from a minuscule 2-inch aperture. The oxygen levels would plummet rapidly, leaving the prisoners in a perpetual state of semi-suffocation, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The hunger was so absolute that during the post-war trials, survivors testified of inmates who, driven mad by starvation in the pitch blackness, attempted to chew and eat their own leather shoes. Beside the standing cells were the starvation cells. Here, prisoners were simply thrown into bare concrete rooms and left without a drop of water or a crumb of bread until they rotted away. It was a silent, slow, and lonely death, designed to break the morale of the remaining inmates who could hear the fading groans of their comrades echoing through the floorboards. Block 11 does not just hold a legacy of individual torture. It is also the birthplace of the industrial-scale slaughter that defined the Holocaust. In September 1941, the Nazi regime was searching for a more efficient, less psychologically taxing method for their execution squads to murder large numbers of people. The camp authorities turned to a commercial pesticide used for fumigation, Zyklon B. The basement of Block 11 became the laboratory for this horrific experiment. Commandant Rudolf Haas personally descended into the basement to oversee the trials. The SS packed a secure room in the cellar with hundreds of Soviet prisoners of war and weakened inmates. The doors were sealed, and the crystalline pellets of Zyklon B were introduced. Haas watched through a peephole as the gas reacted with the air, releasing a lethal wave of hydrogen cyanide. Within minutes, the room fell silent. While the experiment achieved the lethal efficiency the SS wanted, Block 11 itself proved unsuitable for permanent use as a gas chamber. The basement lacked adequate ventilation, making the process of airing out the toxic gas dangerous for the guards. Furthermore, the crematorium used to burn the bodies was located too far away. However, the prototype had worked. Based on the data gathered within the bloody walls of Block 11, the Nazis constructed the massive, specialized gas chambers and integrated crematoria at nearby Auschwitz-Birkenau, scaling up the horror to a level unprecedented in human history. For those who survived the interrogations of the Boger Swing or the suffocating torment of the standing cells, the final destination lay just outside the back door of Block 11. Between Block 10 and Block 11 lay a secluded, enclosed courtyard. To block the view from the rest of the camp, high wooden screens were erected on the sides. At the far end of this yard stood a structure made of black, shock-absorbing insulation boards reinforced with concrete. It was known simply as the Death Wall. Every week, the heavy doors of Block 11 would open, and a line of prisoners would be marched into the courtyard. Many were polished civilians, resistance fighters, or hostages taken from neighboring towns in retaliation for local anti-Nazi activities. They were forced to strip naked. An SS man would lead them 2 by 2 to the wall, forcing them to face the blackboards. There was no trial, no appeal, and no mercy. An SS executioner would step forward with a small caliber rifle and shoot each prisoner in the back of the neck at point-blank range. Thousands met their end against the dark surface of the death wall. The ground of the courtyard was permanently stained a deep, dark crimson. When the executioners were finished, the bodies were loaded onto carts and wheeled away, making room for the next batch of prisoners waiting shivering in the corridors of Block 11. As the Soviet Red Army advanced in 1944, the desperate SS began dismantling the infrastructure of their crimes. The standing cells were ripped out under Haas's successor, Arthur Liebehenschel, and the infamous death wall was taken down in an attempt to hide the sheer scale of the executions. Following the liberation of the camp, the world looked on in horror at the architectural manifestation of absolute cruelty that was Block 11. Rudolf Haas was eventually captured, tried, and in a stroke of historical irony, executed on a specially constructed gallows right inside the Auschwitz camp, mere yards from the complex where he had orchestrated the deaths of over 1 million souls. Today, Block 11 stands as a somber museum and memorial. The death wall has been reconstructed, and flowers are routinely laid at its base by visitors from around the world. The brick building remains frozen in time, a stark, haunting monument to the depths of human cruelty, and a permanent reminder of the resilient spirits who suffered, resisted, and perished within its walls.